Good evening and welcome back to week 11 now of the psychology of organizational development. Today, we'll be learning about team development interventions. So teams are really important in organizations. Essentially, they're the smallest work unit in an organization. And what's a team? Well, a team is a group of people who are working on some common goal, right? They have some common purpose. It's a bit like a smaller version of an organization. If you remember what the definition of an organization was, well, it was one or more people who, it's an entity consisting of one or more persons who have some common purpose. And a team's like that too. But when we look at the people in the team, we see that actually like in an organization, but in a more networked way, they have complementary skills. What does complementary skills mean? It means that their skills complement each other. You do this, I do that in a way that works well together. So different skills that work together well. And I would say that the ability to work together well itself is a skill, because sometimes if you throw people together who have different skills and different perspectives, they can have maladaptive conflicts. So sometimes the textbook talks about individual differences or interpersonal differences as if differences were bad and a cause of conflict. No, differences can be great. It's how you manage the conflict. Anyhow, so we depend on each other to accomplish that common purpose, which means that there's interdependence. And in a well-functioning team, people will hold themselves and each other accountable to working well together, to accomplishing the team goals. There's a couple of different types of teams. There are natural teams, and those are the ones you just find yourself in. When you're working in a certain department, you're on a team because you have been placed on one, because these other folks are all working on the same thing in the same place, and you have monthly or weekly meetings together. Voila, you're a team. And that's kind of part of the organizational structure. And then teams sometimes assemble temporarily in order to go do some project. And then once that project is over, the team disbands. You might wonder how a team is different from a clique. And a team has that work goal, that purpose of completing a task. A clique is 3 or more people who like and trust each other, and so they choose to work together. And cliques can be teams too, and teams can be cliques. So maybe if there's a couple of people you like, you might decide to take on projects with them. Virtual teams are ones like this, and they tend to cut across boundaries. And those boundaries are much broader than you might expect. So virtual teams will cut across departments in an organization. In-person teams are more likely to be people from the same sort of area of the organization. You know, maybe you walk across campus for a meeting, but they're not with people who are in another city. Virtual teams are. And so they cut across departments, even organizations. You might be working with somebody on a virtual team from a different, let's say a different plant or different office from the organization. So I might work with somebody in the Milwaukee office or the Toronto office. They can even cut across the entire organization, so that you might be working with someone from a different organization on some shared tasks. And they cross, provincial boundaries, even national boundaries. Now, the book says that they facilitate the equalization of power relationships. They don't say why. And I was wondering, what do you think? Give you a moment before I answer for you. Well, as you know from our study of organizational culture is communicated through artifacts, which are tangible, visible things that communicate norms that also communicate power relationships. So in this classroom, you can see that I have the power because of the way that I'm standing behind this lectern, and I'm wearing these clothes, and I have this board behind me. And then the students are usually sitting, taking notes, looking up at me, and wearing softer casual clothing. Well, in a virtual team, all of those differences that come to us in through props suddenly become sound waves and pixels. Think of before COVID, maybe you go see your boss who's sitting behind his oak desk wearing his suit in the stone building, and it's got his nameplate on the wall with his title, and it's a nice big corner office. You can see his status there. And there's his secretary's office, and outside there's parking space with his name on it. And now, talking to the same guy, having the same conversation, but you're seeing him in his t-shirt, in his bedroom, maybe you're looking up his nose, and all of a sudden, all of that grandeur falls away, and his voice is coming through the speakers on your computer, and maybe it's easier for you to detect if he's BSing. And when everyone is just little tiles and pictures, those power differences just don't communicate as well. We don't perceive them as much. So I speculate that this is why virtual teams facilitate the equalization of power relationships. And it's interesting to see what's happening in the workplace with, in the post-COVID era, we have way more virtual teams, and many people are leaving their positions in what we call the Great Resignation. Welcome. And is that because you realize something about the nature of your work when you're sitting in your bedroom versus looking at your boss through the computer screen versus when you're in that building surrounded by all those props that communicate the narratives and myths of the organization? So teams sound like they're a good thing, right? Yay, team. In reality, teams are a tool, and they can be used adaptively or maladaptively. There's times, there's contexts, there's situations where a team makes sense, and there's others when it doesn't make sense. And so you need a team when the work is of a highly interdependent nature. If you are building a, I don't know, something really simple, maybe one person can make some very simple object. But let's say you're building a rocket ship. Well, gee, you're going to need all kinds of different people with different skills. You'll need the computer science person and the engineering person and the mechanic and so on. And you'll need managers for all of those people. Teams work when members need to learn from each other's expertise and experience. There may be some situations where my own expertise and experience are enough. So it's kind of like me, the way I'm teaching this class assumes that I have the expertise and the knowledge and the competency to do this without bringing someone else in. But sometimes there's a big problem and we don't really know what to do. And so we need to listen to each other. And more complex problems are more like that. Some problems are owned by one person. This is my class and it's my problem, unless something escalates above the class level. But I kind of own it, right? The syllabus and what goes on here. But sometimes there are problems that have multiple stakeholders and where you really need buy-in from other people, and you need their participation and their engagement. You need to get them to do something. So if they're on the team, they get to participate, they get to be part of the decision making, well, then maybe they'll be more willing to help you follow through on a decision. Sometimes rewards are based on individual performance, and sometimes they're based on team performance. And when people are rewarded according to the performance of an organization or part of it, then it makes sense to have teams. If there was some way to only compensate you for your individual work, then you probably just want to go focus on that. There are some problems, bigger problems, complex problems, social problems that need creative solutions. There's no one obvious answer, because this is a well-worn path and we've solved this problem 10 times before. If you need a creative solution, if there's no one best way and you're not sure what to do, then you're going to want to consider different perspectives and think about, and have a group of people think about what the effects of what the effects might be of what you're doing. Because sometimes one person just doesn't have the perspective or the insight to do that well. There are times when you don't want a team. Sometimes employees are happier and more productive when they are working alone. And that might be the case when their work is highly independent. You might not really need other people, except for, they might have an assistant, they might need to consult sometimes. But if you can mostly work alone, that might be the best way for you to work. Sometimes there's an accepted expert who, doesn't really need to learn from others. I have the image of a dentist in my mind. Like, there might be a hygienist there sometimes when he needs the hygienist, but usually just comes in after, does the things, and goes. And you, the patient, believes that he knows what he's doing with his drill. And I hope he does. But with filling a tooth, there's like one correct solution to that. Basically, you need to fill the cavity, and there's a way to do it. And there's ways that you wouldn't want to do it. I'm not saying it's the easiest thing in the world, but it's fairly straightforward. That's different from really complex problems. Sometimes a problem belongs to one person, right? Maybe your tooth is the responsibility of your dentist in some way. But as we were saying before, some problems have more stakeholders who have a sense of ownership. Working alone makes more sense when rewards are based on individual performance and when that performance is of an independent nature. And sometimes you don't want a team because there's not enough interest in the issue in the organization to cover for the cost of bringing people together into a team, right? They all have to want to be there. There has to be a will for this. And if you're going to have a team, well, you're going to need to have the time to do good teamwork and to develop good team skills. That requires time. And if you throw people together and they don't have the right kind of support, putting them into a team might do more harm than good. So teamwork is quite simply work done by the team. And doing good teamwork requires that members subordinate some of their personal interests, especially any personal need to be on a pedestal and to be the greatest one who has all the great ideas and makes all the great decisions, and subordinate all that ego to the team and for achieving the goal for the common good. And the team needs to agree on what those goals are. As we learned in the unit on process intervention, there are individual functions in a group that can be problematic. Sometimes we have personal needs, like a need for approval, a need to impress people, a need to be seen as smart. Maybe we need we need to feel like other people care about us. And those needs can drive us to do things in teams that are a little dysfunctional from the perspective of the team achieving its goal. And an example of that might be when somebody feels threatened, so they attack someone else, or when somebody feels like they're not accepted or cared about enough, so they tell a lot of personal stories to create intimacy with group members, which actually derails the group from focusing on the task. The example in the textbook is that if you're working on a team, it's more like playing in the orchestra than being the prima donna. A survey by the American Management Association found that the principal causes of interpersonal conflict in organizations were as follows. And notice that I highlighted organizations. What that means is that this study was based on probably a survey that went out to people in organizations that didn't ask about the team context specifically. That's why I highlighted that. But it does show what some common reasons for unhappiness and interpersonal conflicts are, and those are value differences. Values conflicts occur quite commonly, and from what I've read, for people to work together who have different values, they need to not impose their values on the other person. And that can be hard because you probably really believe in your values. And it's a values conflict I see sometimes. There's some people that believe in integrity and doing and saying what they think is the right thing. In really political organizations, it can be more about who you know and how good you make them feel. And so getting along with others is a more important value. And somebody that has that strong value of getting along with others might see the other person's behavior as inappropriate, as making people feel uncomfortable, as causing conflict, etc. Whereas that other person that prizes honesty and confrontation might see the other side as deceitful, unethical, looking the other way when they need to follow up on something slimy, political, etc. How do you work through values differences? It's really hard. And honestly, your best bet is to work for an organization that shares your values. That means that those values are reflected in the organizational culture and everyone goes along with that. Sometimes people disagree on the goal because they just don't have a good common understanding of what the goal actually is. Sometimes they're not good at cooperating. Sometimes they're turf issues. We don't know whose responsibility this issue is. I think it's mine, you think it's yours, I think you're on my turf, that kind of thing. Sometimes people don't perform very well in an organization, and then it's the manager's responsibility to help guide them to better performance. People can feel frustrated and lash out at other people for many different reasons. When stress overwhelms their resources, people in organizations compete over resources. An organization is more than a social space. It's also a political space where people compete for money, for power, for prestige. There's going to be one position and there's, 4 or 5 people competing for it. It's not always a pleasant process. Another thing they list there is not following policies and work rules. Yes, that can be quite stressful. I want you to note that organizational policies can be performative. So policy is an artifact. It's something that you can kind of see, touch, and read. A policy document is there to give guidance to the organization. It might come up, might help settle some kind of a dispute, but it's quite normal for managers to disregard their own policies. So a policy isn't the law, but people in an organization will believe that, oh, that's the policy and that's what we do. And so the policy can be there in order to communicate something about the image, communicate something about the organization that is really more about image and myth and keeping up appearances. And you'll see this a lot with policies on harassment and discrimination. There'll be some policy that says that, oh, if this happens to you, there's some process and you talk to this person about it and there'll be some committee and all these things will happen. And then in reality, is that what really happens? No. So according to a study done by one of my colleagues, when people can submit complaints in an organization, they tend to go right to the university lawyer. That's not in the policy. What? And then the lawyer will treat you like you're like they're the organization of the defendant and you're the threat. And then what the person might get back in return, this can be very traumatizing for students who drank the Kool-Aid, is they'll get a legal defense. So the organization will be more concerned with covering its butt legally, and that's what corporate lawyers for, right? Practically. Maybe not ideally, they should be serving the public interest, but more practically, they serve management and the organization. And then somebody who's maybe had a traumatic experience will have another traumatic experience of the system where they learn that the policy is performative. And so when there's recently a court case in the States over discrimination with the Royal Mail, and the management just acted egregiously, and they got really slammed by the courts. And their statement after was, well, we have a process. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you follow your own process or that it's a good process. Policies can also just be bad policies. Just because there's a policy doesn't mean it's a good policy or an effective policy. Sometimes the people who write policies don't have any competence in policy analysis or in risk management. And you do what you're supposed to do and it's actually harmful. That happens too. Then there are plain old misunderstandings and miscommunications. And there are also personality clashes. And so personality testing is used as a team development intervention. But unfortunately, organizations will use personality measures that they're not really valid or reliable. So you'll see the MBTI and the 4 colors and the DISC. I forgot that one. And the reason you use those is that they're all kind of flattering, especially the MBTI. That one has very flattering reports. And that way people can talk about differences, be like, oh, I see how this trait could be a strength in a certain light. And maybe that could help us appreciate differences. Could be a bit of a conversation starter. Unfortunately, many of those reports themselves are not valid or reliable. They sort of open people up to the idea that, oh, there are differences and we can try to understand each other. Had a slide that ran away. This is an example of a policy that is, in fact, not legally compliant. So I said on the last slide that policies can just be kind of bad policy. Policy is not law, but this is or was, I'm not sure if it's still up, the university's policy on conflict resolution, discrimination, and harassment. And 2 things here, I had 2 arrows. What do they say? This is all going to be very confidential. It does not preclude the discrete disclosure of information in order to elicit the facts of the case or to implement and monitor the terms of any resolution. The way that was used in practice was that people could approach the HR person who was responsible for both writing and implementing this and have conversations held behind the back of the other person that were gossip and rumors. And then the other person wouldn't know that was happening, even though that was their own personal private information. And under the FOIPOP Act, someone else's opinion of you belongs to them. You own the gossip about you. But if you ask for your records, it'd say, well, no, that's confidential. So it's a privacy violation, right? Keeping your personal information from you, who owns it, is a privacy violation. They kind of covered that with confidentiality. And then the other one there on the bottom is very, very concerning. All files shall be treated confidentially in accordance with the FOIPOP Act, unless the complaint is brought before civil or legal authorities. There is no unless. You cannot write a policy that excuses your organization from compliance with the FOIPOP Act. Right? You can't say, well, we'll comply with the act unless this material might be brought to some larger complaint process with civil or legal authorities. Then we'll hide it. You can't do that. but there's a policy that they can't. And most people who are declined and they cite this policy don't realize that, just don't have the legal knowledge to see that, or the skills in policy analysis. Organizations can and do get away with quite a lot. Anyway, on to the problems of teams. There are lots of them. So a team has to have a common goal, but people might not know what that is. You might establish it and then it drifts and derails, and maybe you need to bring people back to the table again to come back to the original goals. As we were saying earlier, there are these individual functions that can lead to unproductive or maladaptive behavior. I highlighted this in yellow. I wrote maladaptive interpersonal conflict because the textbook doesn't say maladaptive. It just says interpersonal conflict, as if conflict is bad and peace and harmony are good. And no, it doesn't work like that. Peace and harmony can be bad, like in the case of groupthink, when nobody is criticizing a bad idea and everyone's being that yes man and being like, wow, this is great. That's how terrible accidents happen. So was it the Apollo disaster, Bay of Pigs? Okay, harmony is not necessarily good, and then conflict is not necessarily bad. There are unproductive conflicts where people are just being rude to each other and ripping each other down, and that distracts from the task. Okay, but then conflict can actually be great if it helps you develop a better product. I did not like the way the textbook talked about individual functions. I noticed that in the chapter on process intervention. I'm noticing it again. That's why I highlighted it in red. They wrote, such interpersonal garbage or hangups need to be brought out and resolved. No, and no. When you're an OD practitioner, do not tell anyone that their conflict is garbage or that their feelings are garbage. There's some personal need that's not met, and you have to think about a skillful way to resolve that. And sometimes that is telling the person that it might be best to drop the issue, but you don't call their feelings garbage. Hang up is also kind of contemptuous. And then there's this idea that any kind of conflict needs to be aired and resolved. And that as well is risky. Sometimes, if it's not going to contribute to the team goal, maybe you agree to disagree. Or maybe you don't go and dig things up or trawl things up. Sometimes you let things go instead of resolving them. So our frame of reference always goes back to, are you and how well is your team achieving the work goal? Teams, just like organizations, have their cultures, but these are subcultures. And sometimes those subcultures can lead to maladaptive behavior. Sometimes there are groups that have antisocial tendencies, and people in the group can start copying each other, and the bad behavior can spread. I've sometimes seen this when I have cheating in a class, but members are in the same group and they kind of talk to each other into doing this. Sorry, it sounds like my email. What else? Decision making. So sometimes that process can be dysfunctional or maladaptive. The textbook says, and you can see I'm going to pick on this again, there's a good deal of evidence showing that decisions implemented by members who use consensus decision-making are more effective. There's no context there. Like, all those studies could be about a particular context. And there's some contexts where consensus decision making is better, like where you need to get buy-in, where it's something controversial, where multiple stakeholders need to participate in the solution. And then there's times where we know what to do and we have to go do it. There's situations where there isn't the time for consensus decision making. Teams in the Ukrainian military right now are probably not using consensus decision making. They're doing what the commander says. Okay, so I'm seeing this pattern, and everywhere in psychology is reifying something as good or bad without understanding that's about adaptive and maladaptive, and that depends on a context. Leadership. sometimes the degree of power and control that that members have is inappropriate. Sometimes there'll be one person that dominates the group. Some people will stand back and not contribute as much or enough. Some groups benefit from more structure and more authoritative approaches, and some need flatter structures. And that often has to do with the kind of work that they're doing. I think engineers just like to go off and do their own thing and then come back together. Size also matters. The textbook puts the ideal size as, they were talking about 5 to 7, and then sometimes we're talking about 3 to 4. But your bottom of your range is about 3, and top is about 9. Even, I would say that a group of 9 or 10 can be quite hard to manage as a team, because as the team gets larger, there's more interconnections between members of the group. So think about a team of 3. So there's the relationship between person 1 and person 2, the relationship between person 1 and person 3, and the relationship between person 2 and person 3. And that's not many connections, but now increase that to 9. And so you have the relationship between person 1 and person 2, person 1 and person 3, person 1 and person 4, person 2 and person 3. You see the problem? So that's already a lot of connections. And then there's more than just the dyadic connections in that group of 9. What if these 3 people work together and those 3 people work together and there's another group of 3? What if you have cliques? And in fact, when you have larger teams, what happens is they start to break down naturally into subgroups. Group issues that are unresolved lead to reduced motivation and morale, to reduced effectiveness and efficiency. You can waste a lot of time on these problems, and it can lead to poor results and reduced productivity. So we want to have a team working well together, efficiently, effectively. And that is not something that happens immediately. If you remember from our earlier class, there are these stages to team development where at first you don't know each other. You have to get to know each other. There's forming, then there's storming when all these conflicts come up, and then you develop your norms, and then you get to the stage of performing before you finally adjourn. And the textbook gives a good example of like a pro basketball team. When you see them out there on the court and they're performing so well, do you imagine that they never practice? They have to. And so effective team development, effective team functioning is also something, it's a practice skill. It takes time. And there might be a lot of practice to get to that point where you're working together really well. Now, groups can work really well together to a bad end. And so you have a lot of cohesiveness and everyone's being really agreeable and nobody's being disagreeable and critical. The group can end up doing dumb things together. That's called groupthink. And the text has mentioned that a deterioration of reality testing. What's reality testing? It's my awareness of the real world. This is a whiteboard and it's here. But sometimes managers can get really kind of far away from a problem. Imagine Vladimir Putin's troops on the battlefield, what they're experiencing in the trenches, and whatever idea he and his generals have in their heads, which is out to lunch. They have this very poor reality testing. They seem to understand what's actually going on. And there's many reasons for that. Sometimes when a person has power, people don't want to tell them that things are going wrong because they might shoot the messenger. And there can be group pressures inside where people, think that, if you say that, that could make someone feel uncomfortable, so you better not, right? Pressure to keep the peace. And so one way around this, and it's the way that it was the way things were done when I was doing process interventions in the College of Pharmacy. We had assigned one person in the group to be the skeptic. And everyone knew that, Jenny was the skeptic today, and that's why she's saying these things that seem to undermine the consensus. And you can be kind of good-natured about it and compliment the person on their skills and say, hey, good point. and the person feels less awkward doing it, and they're not sort of perceived as, let's say, a political threat. You know that they're on the team and they're doing their thing and they're not trying to be a problem or not trying to take over. So that's one thing you can do. 8 characteristics of groupthink. One of them is the illusion of invulnerability. So the group can come to become a bit prideful and overestimate its power. They might take silly risks. They don't notice or respond to clear warnings of danger. And when something might come to their attention, they have a rationalization for it. So together, talking to each other, they will socially construct reasons why it's okay to ignore or dismiss negative information or warnings. They develop an illusion of morality. So they think of themselves as good and virtuous, and they think of their opponents are evil, their opponents as totally evil, so they can't listen to them. They can't learn from them. They can't get any feedback from them or consider their perspective. I'm just going to contemptuously dismiss them. It will stereotype the other groups, so they don't understand them. You don't understand their opponent groups, but they think they do. And so they'll say, well, we don't need to talk to them. We know what they're all about. And in a way that shows, again, that contempt for the other groups. There's pressure within the group to keep the peace. So they'll put pressure on each other to agree. They'll silence, shut down, and police against disagreement. And under circumstances like that, when there's a culture like that, people will self-censor. So they won't say what they really think. It's just easier to go along to get along. And when this is happening, that can create an illusion of unanimity. When everyone is doing that, you think everyone agrees. So maybe they really actually don't. And when this is happening, there's often some kind of a toxic leader and an unhealthy coercive power dynamic. So people might be going along with things when they know better because they're afraid of what might happen to them if they don't. It's hard to imagine people choosing to be like that. Then there are the mind guards, and I have seen these folks in operation, and it's unreal. A mind guard might be the kind of general that does not tell Putin about the extent of his battlefield losses because he doesn't want any polonium in his tea, what he might do. So these folks will protect the leader and other compliant members of the group from anything that sort of might upset them. And I've seen this at town halls. So sometimes organization has these town hall meetings, and the leader will speak about issues in the organization, and they invite your feedback, and you type your feedback into a chat box, but it's moderated. And I've seen live a moderator not reading the question word for word, but communicating something to the leader that makes the question really innocuous. So if it had any punch, any bite, any criticism, it's gone. And the question becomes really innocent and innocuous. And the leader's like, well, that's a good question. And it's something non-threatening. And the moderator did that. I'm not sure why, maybe because they would be punished if they were to allow the leader to be embarrassed in front of people. I'm not sure, but it certainly happens. So a major function of OD practitioners, and it might be the biggest one, and it might be the bestest one, is team development. You'll also hear that called team building. And the purpose of team development is to increase the productivity and effectiveness of the team's work. It's ultimately about the work, not self-discovery or making friends or finding the meaning of life. It's about productivity and effectiveness of the teamwork. That's what we're always going to be referring back to. And what do we do in team development? Well, we might examine the team's goals, look at its structure, its procedures, look at its culture, norms, relationships between people. And we might try to improve the effectiveness of communication, cooperation, and cohesiveness. And we do that using those process intervention skills that we discussed in the previous chapter. And when the OD practitioner or the team leader starts off by modeling these process intervention skills, the group will eventually learn them and be able to use them on each other and become self-managing. Now, I added something there and I highlighted it in yellow. I added effectiveness of, because the textbook said, actually said like increase communication or increase cohesiveness. Well, we already know that increasing cohesiveness isn't necessarily good. So that's why I threw in the effectiveness bit, improving effectiveness, making it more adaptive. Because increasing communication isn't necessarily a good thing. So let's say you have a team and you get everybody to, you increase communication by having everyone say what they were going to say three times as many words. Well, isn't that increasing communication? If you got them all to talk about what they did over the weekend, well, that's increasing communication. It's not necessarily effective or adaptive. And we do want to take those things like communication, cooperation, and cohesiveness, and make sure that they're applied in ways that bring us to our goals. And the goals have to work for the individuals, for the team, and also for the organization. You wouldn't want to have a team that undermines the organization. So, well, why do we use team development? Because teams are the basic work groups in organizations. Teams are, even though they're really about work in an organization, they actually are really personally important for people. They give you a sense of identity. They're people you can talk to when you're processing change and what it means. They answer to those personal needs. And one big reason is that teams can be pretty dysfunctional. And when you're looking for sources of inefficiency in an organization, you'll find much of that at the team level. So the operating problems of work groups are big sources of organizational efficiency. And the issues are things like lack of clear objectives. We don't all know what we're doing, interpersonal conflicts, ineffective communications, decision-making, and issues with power or authority. We went over those before. Do we need team development? Well, it depends on the situation, because you might not need a team. In a simple situation, you might not need a team at all, but it might be important for that single person who's working on a simple problem to have good social skills so that they can go consult with somebody, so that they can be polite to the secretary, so that they can get along with their own boss. So that's social skills or personal skills. That's not really team development. So they're not even in a team. Then there are complex situations that require people to be in groups. And that's where you need teams who have process skills. Things like political skills, listening skills, skills in how to share and how to persuade, how to coach. Then there are what they call problem situations. I thought that's an odd word to choose. And I wondered if they were getting the idea of wicked problems. There are really big, messy problems that are important problems. They have a lot of stakeholders. They are unique in some ways. They involve interdependency between those stakeholders, and they have a big impact. And an example of a wicked problem is student retention. There are so many factors outside the organization that impact student retention. Like what other universities are competing for students, what community colleges or their workplaces. So there's all those other competitors. Then there are social factors that can make it easier or harder for people to attend university? Let's say they become parents. What's the childcare situation? And can you see that it depends on so many things socially at a high level? And then inside the organization, you could ask, well, how are the faculty working together in departments? Sometimes that's really not well. How are faculty working with staff, with the administration? Also often not well. Like, can you see like how big and messy that problem is? And so wicked problems require excellent teamwork and the highest level of interpersonal skills, because you really have to collaborate. Now, in our last class before the break, we did a team development activity, and that was the career development game, Who You Are Matters. And for your participation, I asked you to answer the question, was playing this game a good team development intervention? Why or why not? And nobody said that it wasn't. Everyone said they liked it, but let's see why. I heard that it helps to get to know yourself better. So you're learning what your skills are, what your passions are, what your strengths are. But that question wasn't about, is this a good career development intervention for you as an individual? It's about the team. So why does it matter that you get to know yourself better? And it could be that you realize what your strengths are, and so you should be playing to those, and it might help you decide how you're going to contribute to your team. Many of you said that it helped you get to know each other as individuals, to break the ice, discover common ground, and connect with each other. Some of you said that you discovered that you had similar struggles, and that helped you develop empathy and compassion for each other. And that's useful when you're working together or navigating conflict. Said that it helped you develop more respect for each other's needs, and that you encouraged each other on your journeys regarding shared struggles where you could advise each other. It was interesting to see that one of the groups had basically the exact same goals, and that was the self-selected group. So there's one group of 3 students just said, hey, we're working together. And it's interesting that it suggests that when people choose to work together, they have sort of a shared perspective and a lot in common, and that can be a source of strength, and it can also be a weakness, because sometimes people who are similar come up with the same solutions to a problem, and diversity can help us be more creative. You said that it helped you practice your team skills. I thought that was an interesting thing to say, and a very good point. So you practice sharing ideas, communicating with each other, giving constructive, actionable feedback. The game gave you some guidance on how to give feedback, and it wasn't to say, wow, that was a stupid idea. You were able to benefit from each other by giving and receiving feedback. And you provided perspective to each other. One student wrote, it's always lovely that people can see what you cannot see from another perspective. You learned about your own strength, and you also learned about each other's strengths, and that could help you better assign tasks in the group. I agree. Another skill that the game made you do was work together to figure out the rules. It had a clear goal, so it gave you good structure, and I was glad to hear that it was fun. You can see from the website for the game that it is offered as doing all kinds of things, as being good for classrooms, and being good for career counselors, and being good for team development in the workplace. And you guys did seem to enjoy it as an icebreaker, but and maybe it has its place. I'd certainly use it again. Would this help train a team to work better on their work goal? I don't know. And I would say it doesn't map on very well to what the textbook is saying about what we'd look for in a good team development intervention. So you would need to identify your objectives as a group and set priorities. The game gave you an objective, and so in that little context, you can see, oh, having, a clear objective is great, but are you going to go back to your assignment team and also come up with a clear objective? A good team development interventions help you examine your team performance. The game didn't do that because it's its own little world. It should help you analyze group process, improve communication, maybe you did that. Should improve your problem-solving ability. Is the kind of problem that you were solving in the game the same kind of problem as you're solving in your work team? Maybe there's high correspondence, maybe there's generalizability, maybe there's not. It should increase cooperation. Maybe it did that. Should help you work more effectively with other teams. That's called inter-team development, and the game didn't do that. But I think inter-team development can also be looked at as a separate issue. Once your team is functioning well together, then you're in a position to move to the next level, which is working with other teams, which you hope are also well functioning internally. And it should help you increase your respect for your other team members. And it sounds like it actually did that based on your feedback. There are two types of team development processes. There are diagnostic meetings and team building meetings. I've heard about team building meetings, heard about diagnostic meetings. I've never heard anyone in my life call them family group diagnostic meetings or family group team building meetings. I'm not sure where that comes from, and I think it might sound strange if you said it in an organizational context. So let's stick to diagnostic meetings and team building meetings. Diagnostic meetings are aimed at identifying issues in the group. And in my experience, when I've had those meetings, it's with a supervisor or the leader of the group without the people in the group present, because that is such a confronting conversation. Like, hey, what's wrong with this group and whose fault is it? If you do have this conversation with a group, which I've had as part of debrief processing, it's not necessarily easy to do. In my time, I've done it well and I've done it poorly. And if you have to raise issues in ways that are very diplomatic, that don't stigmatize any one particular member, even if one person is the problem. And sometimes you have to pull that one person aside and have a private conversation with them. Diagnostic meetings would reflect what you learned about diagnosis. So how do you collect data? Who do you talk to understand the problem? The whole group or certain people from the group? Do you meet one-on-one? And then there are team building meetings, and those are aimed at improving the team's functioning. And we can do that in different ways. One way might be training process intervention skills. And then there are things like going rock climbing and playing board games. And does that work? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If we're doing team development well, somebody would initiate that. Who initiates it? Could be somebody on the team, could be manager or the leader of the team, or it could be from above in the organization. But at the end of the day, everybody on the team needs to want to do this. You'll set objectives for the team development. You'll need to collect data, just like we learned about in the diagnostic process. And then you will need to have the meeting before the meeting. So you have a meeting where you plan what's going to happen at this team development meeting. You come up with the agenda, maybe you set ground rules. This is the meeting before the meeting to set everything up so that it goes well at the actual meeting. And then you have the meeting. And ideally, team development meetings are done off-site. If people in the organizations wear uniforms. It's probably better if they're not wearing their uniforms. And that's for the same reason that we like virtual teams. It strips away some of that role of organizational culture and myth and narrative and all the things you're conditioned to from being in this environment. And also it takes away some of the demonstrations of power that are in our costume. Now, when you have a team development meeting, it's fairly normal for the leader to come under fire because leaders are responsible for organizational culture and in a team for team culture. And if that's dysfunctional or unhealthy, yes, they will come under fire. The textbook says, if the members feel that this is an opportunity for them to express open and honest feelings without fear of punishment, the leader of the team may come under attack. So if they feel safe, which is actually a big step, and in workplaces that are a bit toxic, often people don't feel safe, then the leader of the team may come under attack. And the practitioner should forewarn and prepare the leader for this eventuality. You have a role here as the OD practitioner. You don't let them go into that and be humiliated and yell at people and have an outburst. People who are conflict avoidant, I believe, are not suited for leadership. Neither are people who are fragile and need to save face. And maybe the person that's leading the team is a good fit for that role, and maybe they're not. But why am I saying this? So that you can expect it and prepare for it a bit. Sometimes as a practitioner, you have to intervene if things sort of get nasty. And one way to do that is to remind everyone of the common goal and get them back on track. Then at the end, if you're going to evaluate the team development process, you need objective benchmarks for that. So how do you know if things are going to be going better? Is it because everyone feels less stressed out? Is it because we get through meetings faster and we don't spend so much time on unimportant stuff? Is it because we're making more sales? Is it because we have a better product that we're selling more of? You need to establish those benchmarks. Now then, you may have experienced team development as outdoor experiential laboratory training. And that's when people who work together go to some other environment where there's going to be some kind of exercises. So maybe you've done things like have teams compete when they're, you call that tug of war, pulling on a rope, or maybe you have a blindfold on and someone else is leading you. And this is supposed to lead to some kind of discussion about how you work. So maybe there's the blindfolded exercise is about trust or about obeying orders. And then afterwards, the team is supposed to discuss what they learned and how that applies to work. I have seen these things take place without any discussion afterwards. It's like, oh, okay, that was great. See you all at work on Monday. But you should talk about it and try to make those connections back to the workplace. There should be an assessment before an intervention like this to know that it's appropriate. And what if there are accessibility issues, for example? There should be an orientation first. So you don't just throw people into this tug of war or the rock climbing. You'd have an orientation where the facilitator would explain that, this is about comfort zones or this is about trust. The exercises should fit people's abilities. So, you have people in the workplace who have a wheelchair. Well, what are they going to do when you go on the rock climbing adventure, the whitewater rafting? Again, team is supposed to participate and then reflect on the process and follow through with some kind of goal setting or planning that's about changing what they do in the workplace based on what they learned. So you're supposed to bring this all back home at the end. Safety, they say, is a major concern. And you could see that with something like rock climbing or whitewater rafting. My friend was doing some things that were like zip lining and going on wobbly bridges. The organization is liable if there's an accident, and accidents can happen. I added accessibility because I didn't know that that was very clearly there in the textbook. They did say ability, but you would want to talk to people about whether this is a good idea, is this something they can participate in? Even if you're going to offer, say, a lunch, well, are there people there with dietary restrictions? You can see that if you want to do this well and meaningfully, it's more work than it seems. Participation should be voluntary. And, well, in an organization where there's power relationships, that's always a little compromised. But people are supposed to have fun, and it shouldn't be too tortured with all its connections to the workplace. The textbook gave the example of some kind of a hiking team building activity where the boss asked the manager to carry his backpack, and the manager said no, and the boss fired him. See how you're still like really at work? So ideally, you're supposed to be able to let this all go and have fun, but seriously, you're still in that organizational context. And I find that sometimes interventions in psychology, theories in psychology, just miss that context. And that's probably because psychology is about the individual. It's about individual differences. And so it tends to not understand us as members of groups or societies very well. Another issue, and it's in yellow because I added it, is that generalizability matters. How do you transfer of training matters? And we know, for instance, that training somebody on a soft skill like communication skills, it's vague and fuzzy, doesn't transfer well to another organization. So you train somebody up to have excellent communication skills, they go somewhere else and they're like, what? They don't see that. So how do you know that this blindfolded trust exercise is actually going to make the person more trusting back in that board? Like, what if it's some kind of a cutthroat corporate culture? Why should they be more trusting? And maybe a person smart enough to know the difference between that boardroom setting and that blindfold game that you had team development exercise. And then all these links that we're making back to the workplace they're ideas, they're conversations, they're speculative. I was once a participant in one of these trust building exercises, and I was there was a guy standing in front of me, and he was supposed to like fall backwards and allow himself to fall. And I was supposed to catch him. And that was supposed to demonstrate that he could trust me. But for some reason, like maybe I stood a little bit too far back, maybe he was bigger than me and he came at me faster than I thought. And I didn't quite catch him. And another reason might be because I didn't know that then, but I have an astigmatism. So I have trouble with depth perception. So maybe I didn't realize how far he was or how fast he was carrying. Anyway, he was upset about this. But does that mean that I actually have some kind of trust issues, that, I don't have his back, or was it my astigmatism? And how much are we going to gain from thinking and talking about this? Maybe it's all a big waste of time. Lost my clicker. There it is. That there was on one of the quizzes, I made a joke about Max from organization B, who wanted to do this team development activity that was obviously iatrogenic, and we know Max from organization B thought it was a great idea, and we know he's a jerk, and I called it licks and drinks. That is a real team development intervention that I found online. Build strong teams with golf building, team building event. So licks and drinks gives you time to mix golf with meetings and other team building activities, and then have drinks. And how is this going to help you? I don't know, but you could see how maybe a manager might like the idea of spending some of this leftover budget on some golf activity. Doesn't mean it's going to help. On to role analysis. So role ambiguity and role conflict are major issues in teams. They're major issues in organizations. They're really big sources of stress. So role ambiguity is when you don't completely know what others expect of you. And we talked about that. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Johari window. And there's the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Role ambiguity can be a known unknown. You might be like, oh, I don't know what I'm supposed to do or what they want me to do. And sometimes people are just kind of clueless. And there's role conflicts because there's an expectation from the team member, and then they just don't get it and they're doing their own thing. And they don't understand this is upsetting people. So there's role ambiguity. That's not knowing what other people expect. That can be stressful. And then another source is role conflict, where you're expected to do something, you're not doing it. The psychological contract activity that we did at the beginning of class was something that I hoped would help reduce some role ambiguity and help you understand, what I expect of you and help me understand what you expect of me. Another technique they suggest here is role analysis. And the steps are that first, the incumbent of the role, so let's say it's me, would describe my role as I see it. And then other people can share what their expectations of me are, and I'll share my expectations of you. We kind of did this, right? In that psychological activity, contract activity. And then I would make a summary, like what I did on the board. That's like a role profile, right? You expect me to do that whole list of things. And in a role analysis, everyone would do that. I sort of had you do that as the students speaking for the groups, but imagine on a team, everyone as an individual would do that. And then you would review these profiles periodically. This assumes that you have the time to do it and to do it well. It also assumes good group functions. Like imagine if we have a dysfunctional team and everyone is modifying this list of things you're supposed to do until everyone agrees. I could see that being a long meeting. This also completely empowers the people in the group to define the role, and it assumes that they have the authority and the knowledge to do so. But in reality, maybe management, HR, legal services, and the employee unions have an opinion on what your role is, and there's a contract that requires you to do this and not that. So maybe it's not all up to you and your team. Another tool is role negotiation, and that's about negotiating these roles between team members. And in role negotiation, members sort of discuss what they want from one another and why. And there's an assumption there that there's going to be good process, that we're only going to be talking about task-based topics and not personal things. I really wish you wouldn't do something that's intrusive, make a comment that's intrusively personal. So this kind of assumes that you have pretty good group process already, and it assumes that you are safe to actually have that discussion frankly. It's a big assumption. So what are the steps in role negotiations? So in step one, which is contract setting, each member prepares a list for each of the other members. Obviously, your team can't be too big to do this well. And there's 3 headings in the list: things to do more of, things to do less of, and things to do the same. So this is what's working. Here's what's not working. This is the constructive feedback. Do more of this, do less of that. What I'm noticing off the bat is people need to have you have to have a healthy team dynamic to do this well. Like sometimes people come up with things that seem insulting. And it assumes there's no context here. Like we're saying things to do more of, like communicate more. But there isn't an understanding of context or adaptivity. So it's actually important for people to understand why they should do more of that. How is that helpful? And why should you do less of this? How is that thing you're doing unhelpful in the context of the goal that we're trying to accomplish? Step 2 is issue diagnosis. And then each member would write out a master list that combines the list written about them and post it on the wall. That's a really high level of transparency. I would be super comfortable with that. I can imagine some people feeling overwhelmed by writing what everyone thinks about you on the wall. And then you're supposed to sort of ask to clarify anything. And you should then negotiate it by getting into pairs to decide what you think the most important changes are. And I don't know why they're saying like divide everyone into pairs. Like, why not have it as a whole group discussion? And then you're supposed to come up with a written role negotiation agreement. And it's written down and spells out the agreements and concessions that each party finds satisfactory. This sounds like a dispute to me that is being mediated, and we're going to write some kind of agreement. I don't love this, but it's in your textbook. So there you go. Thank you for your attention. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that? Okay, then. So for next class, please read chapter 11, which is on intergroup development. It's on how groups work together. And I'm going to offer you guys a bonus point opportunity. The psychology department is having its first EDIA conference this Friday. And it is the very hard work of the department EDIA committee over the last 2 years. And I have shared the conference schedule with you. It's in person and it's also available online. And submits a 1-page reflection. That's like 250 words, something meaningful and coherent. And now I'm available for 3 minutes for any office hours, and I will stop the recording here.